My guess is that you are in a different season of motherhood now. Maybe your kids are older, maybe they're getting ready to leave the house, maybe they're already adults. And somewhere along the way, you have started to notice this really quiet reflection showing up for you. It's not loud, it's not dramatic. It's actually very, very subtle. You have begun to see things a little more clearly now. Clear in a way you just couldn't when you were in the thick of it. When you were surviving, managing, juggling the kids and school and schedules and bills, the house and work and everyone else's needs. And that right there, that is important. Because back then, you didn't have the space or time to reflect. You had to function. And so before we go any further, I want you to know this. These reflection audios that I've created for you, they're not meant to be listened to in order. There is no starting point here. And if a title pulled you in, that's where you're meant to begin. And one last thing before we start. This isn't about fixing the past. It is about understanding it. Understanding it without punishing yourself for what you couldn't see then. Okay? Let's begin. There is a moment that happens for many mothers in this season. It doesn't have a tendency to announce itself. It doesn't come with certainty. It almost just quietly lands. And it's the moment you realize that your child sees you differently than you see yourself. Now, sometimes it happens in a sentence. Sometimes it happens in tone. Sometimes it's what they don't say anymore. And sometimes it's not even spoken. You just feel this shift. See, your child is older now, 16, 18, 21, old enough to remember, old enough to interpret, and old enough to tell their story. And suddenly, you're aware of something that didn't exist before. That they no longer are seeing you through dependence, but rather seeing you through meaning. And this is one of the most disorienting moments in motherhood. Not because you didn't expect feedback, but because you didn't expect this version of it. See, they experienced you differently than you experienced yourself. And for many mothers, that realization doesn't come with clarity, but rather comes with confusion. And there's a very ordinary way this shows up for a lot of mothers. It's generally not during a big conversation. It's not during a big confrontation. It's in the kitchen or the car or just passing each other in the hallway. Your child says something offhand. Not cruel, not dramatic, just casual. Something like, "You were always stressed. I didn't feel like I could ever talk to you. You normally didn't listen to me back then." And they say it the way adults say things, without heat, without urgency, but you feel it. That internal pause, that moment where your body goes a little still and time seems to slow down. Because you weren't bracing for that. You weren't prepared. You were just standing there being you. And this is often where the confusion starts, because you remember trying, caring, holding things together, and suddenly you're holding two versions of the same season. And you don't know which one you're supposed to believe. For most mothers, the first response isn't anger, it's actually shock. Is that really how they saw me? Is that who I was to them? And then the mind does what it always does when something threatens identity. It searches for certainty. It searches for either they are wrong or I'm worse than I thought. And see, there is very little room for complexity at first because when your child is this age, their words feel settled and formed. And that makes the feedback feel very permanent. And I see this moment over and over in my coaching work. Mothers generally don't come in angry, they come in very quiet. They say things like, if my child sees me in this way, then everything I believed about myself must be wrong. Because this doesn't feel like feedback, it feels like a verdict. And see, once identity gets involved, the nervous system reacts. It brings up defensiveness and over explaining, over apologizing, or maybe you just shut down completely. But none of those responses lead to repair. They're all about survival. And here's a distinction most mothers were never taught to make. Your child's experience is real. However, it is not the same as your identity. But over-responsible mothers tend to collapse those two things. Instead of hearing, this is how it felt to them, they hear, this is who I was. And once that identity feels threatened, everything feels dangerous. But I want to be clear here. Responsibility matters, listening matters, and impact matters. But see, responsibility doesn't mean erasing your context or flattening your story. It doesn't even mean adopting your child's narrative as the only truth. Because ownership asks something much more mature, which is, can I acknowledge impact without disappearing? Can I stay regulated without defending? See, that's not passivity, that's leadership. And one of the most important things I pay attention to in this work is language. And I know you hear me say this over and over again, but this isn't just the language that you use with your children, but the language you use about yourself. Because when your internal language sounds like, I damaged them, I ruined something permanently, your nervous system hears threat, and no one listens well from threat. And if you want to stay connected to your 16 or 21-year-old, then regulation must come first. Not through perfection, but through presence. There's another place mothers get stuck here. It sounds reasonable, it sounds insightful, it sounds like growth, and it sounds like this. If I had known then what I now know, I would have done it differently. And that's true. Of course you would have. But here's what we often miss. You are judging a past version of yourself with present day awareness. You are asking someone who didn't have the language yet, the regulation or the support, to perform at the level she hadn't even learned yet. And then you're surprised when that judgment hurts. Because that thought, I would have done it differently, can either become wisdom or a weapon. See, wisdom says, I've grown and I'm becoming this new person, where a weapon says, I should have been someone else. And those two paths lead to two very different places. One leads to steadiness, and the other leads to constant self-interrogation. And many mothers don't realize they have slipped into the second one until reflection itself becomes exhausting. But this is where integration actually begins. Not when you decide who's right, not when you settle on a single version of the story, but when you stop asking, which perspective do I accept? And start asking, okay, how do I stay present to complexity without losing myself? See, most mothers were never taught how to do this. They were taught to either defend or collapse, to either explain themselves or to take all the blame. But see, integration doesn't live in either of those places. Integration is a skill. And like any skill, it requires slowing down. Slowing down so much that it sounds like this: that I can acknowledge my child's experience without turning it into a final judgment about who I am. It sounds like I can take responsibility for impact without erasing context. It sounds like I can stay regulated even when I don't like how I'm being seen. And that's not avoidance, that's emotional maturity. And this is often the moment I pause mothers in coaching, because the impulse is to do something with the insight, to apologize more, to explain more, to repair faster. But integration doesn't rush. Integration asks, can I let this be information and not identity? Can I let awareness inform how I show up now instead of using it to interrogate the past? And that shift matters, because when insight becomes interrogation, growth turns punitive. And when growth turns punitive, connection shuts down, both with yourself and with your child. Integration also means recognizing this: your child is still forming their story, just like you are. At 16, 18, 21, their understanding of you will evolve as they mature, regulate, and gain context. And your steadiness now plays a role in that evolution. Not by correcting their memory, not by rewriting history, but by modeling something different in the present. See, this is about presence and regulation and ownership without erasing who you are. This is how adult to adult relationships begin to take shape. Not through perfection, but through consistency. And consistency, I can tell you, requires you to remain whole. So if you're navigating relationship with a teenager or a young adult who sees you differently than you see yourself, I don't want you to rush to correct their version. And I don't want you to collapse into it. I want you to slow down for a minute. Your child's experience matters, and so does your humanity. Ownership here is staying regulated in the tension, listening without disappearing, but also taking responsibility without rewriting yourself as a mistake. See, this is not the end of your story as a mother. It's the beginning of a more honest one. And I want you to stay here, because this is where real connection becomes possible.